All right, everyone, welcome back. Thank you for coming back this afternoon. I'm in the very fortunate position of introducing two people who really need no introduction, especially to this audience. John Curtis was keeper of the Middle East Department of the British Museum from 1989 to 2011. During which time he curated a number of very important exhibits, including Art and Empire, Treasures from Assyria in the BM, and Forgotten Empire, The World of Ancient Persia. John's work on the history and archaeology of Iran and Iraq has been absolutely prolific. When I checked the other day, it's probably not even up to date on the British Academy website. It says he's published 23 books, more than 100 articles. I shudder to think the energy that has gone into that. I certainly don't have it. John is now CEO of the Iran Heritage Foundation and is here to talk to us about the destruction, preservation, and restoration of cultural heritage in Iraq. So welcome, John.
Thank you for that very kind introduction, and thank you too to Fiona Hara for inviting me to give a lecture at this very interesting event. I should start, I think, by saying that the subject which I've got is obviously an enormous one. I can't possibly cover all aspects of it, so I'm going to really focus on some case studies, and I hope in the course of the lecture make some observations which we can perhaps talk about later. One thing I won't be doing in this lecture is trying to establish who was responsible for what and why they did it. I'm going to leave that to my colleague Matthew Bogdanos. I think that'll probably be perhaps the main thrust of his paper. So what I'm going to do, as I said, is look at some case studies, tell you what's happened, and make some remarks about recovery and restoration. I'm starting with the Iraq Museum, then I'm going to go on to the Mosul Museum, then we'll look at some of the sites in southern Iraq that I visited in 2008. Then we'll look at Babylon and Mosul, Nemrut, and we'll finish up with the Basra Museum, which Eleanor referred to this morning. Well, I arrived in Baghdad, in this context that is, on the 24th of April 2003, which was 13 days after the looting, and Matthew Bogdanos was already there with his US Cultural Protection Force, but at that moment nobody had done anything much, and everybody was in a state of shock, and you'll see why, because these were the sorts of scenes which greeted everybody in the Iraq Museum. Statues thrown to the floor and smashed, and very often trampled underfoot. That was in the public galleries. Then in the offices, of which I think there were about 100, every single one of them had been broken into, the safes ransacked, and where there were antiquities in the storerooms, thrown onto the floor. What you can see here on the left is some trayfuls of ancient ivories. Well, I won't talk too long about the Iraq Museum, because I think probably Matthew's going to come back to that. But it's worth recording that of about, let's say, 50 really important pieces that were still in the galleries, a lot of the items had already been removed to what was called a secret store, and those were untouched. But of about 50 items that were left behind in the galleries, these are some of them which, thanks to the efforts of people like Matthew and Donny George, were recovered. And of these important items from the galleries, I think there's only two really significant things which are still missing. One's this wonderful ivory plaque showing a lioness attacking an Ethiopian, and the other is a head from Hatra. The objects in the storerooms haven't fared so well. It's very difficult to cite numbers, mainly because the records in the Iraq Museum were very imprecise in the first place. But it's thought that probably around 16,000 objects were missing, and round about 8,000 of those have been recovered. So still out there is about 8,000, including the Iraq Museum's incomparable collection of seals. That's the bad news. The good news is that the Iraq Museum did reopen in 2005, due largely to the thanks of Italian colleagues and the generosity of the Italian government. And as you'll see here, it's already attracting large numbers of visitors. So full credit to our Italian colleagues for enabling that to happen. And I only wish that the British government was so generous. The Italians have a wonderful record around the world, I think, of promoting, restoring cultural heritage. Well, now I'll come on now to the Mosul Museum. This was similarly looted on the 10th to 11th of April 2003, exactly on the same dates as the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, which certainly lends support to the belief that all of this looting and ransacking was in some kind of a way orchestrated, but I think even to this day we don't exactly know by who, but it certainly can't be a coincidence that it happened at exactly the same time. So these are views in the Mosul Museum. On the left is the bronze gates from Balawat in northern Iraq. The wood, of course, is modern, but the bronze sheeting on top of it is all ancient, and most of it, as you see, has been ripped off. It wasn't actually as bad, the damage in Mosul Museum, as the damage in Baghdad, I have to say, but unfortunately, worse was to befall the Mosul Museum, and I'll fast forward now to 2015, and this is the damage as recorded on one of the ISIS videos. There was a lot of material still left in the Mosul Museum, as I said, after the looters had entered in 2003. And most of the material in the museum was actually original pieces. It's very unfortunate that at the time the early news broadcasts said that a lot of the damage inflicted by ISIS hadn't been bad because most of the pieces in the museum were casts. That actually was not true. They're nearly all originals, either Assyrian pieces or pieces from Hatra. So their loss is indeed very, very unfortunate, but since this disaster, two archaeologists, Chance Cohenow and Matthew Vincent, have been working to create a virtual Mosul Museum online, and in January of this year there was even an exhibition in the museum of virtual representations of destroyed artifacts that were recreated as high-quality 3D prints, and that was done in collaboration with Google Arts and Culture. And they were able to do this through the two archaeologists through crowdsourcing thousands of photographs. Going back again now to another image from Mosul Museum, to 2003. In those years, 2003-4, a lot of archaeological sites were very badly looted. I expect Matthew will talk about this in due course. One of the worst affected was Isin in southern Iraq. All of these little holes over the site represent diggings by looters. Another very badly affected site was Ummah, and in 2008, so this is a few years after, and one wasn't quite sure what the situation was in 2008, a small group of us, which actually included the chairman of the State Board of Antiquities and Heritage, was able, actually it was organized by the British Army. We were able to visit some 8 sites in southern Iraq to establish how bad the looting had been and still was. And the picture that we got was actually a very mixed one. In some places, we discovered damage that had been caused even before the war started. This is the famous site of Tel Ubaid, which is near Ur. And what you can see here is hollows which have been dug out by the Iraq Army for military vehicles. This was to defend the main road coming up from the south that the coalition troops were using. So they turned this ancient site into a fortified defensive position. So that's the damage that you can see in that place. So it's not quite true, obviously, to say that all or most of the military damage is caused by coalition forces. It's rather shared between the two. Lhasa, the site that we went to, there was looting, but it appeared not to have been as bad as at Ummah and Isin, and hadn't occurred recently. So what we found was a mixture in 2008. Some looting still continuing, but on a limited level. Some sites are still quite bad. I'm showing you these pictures of Ur because, of course, it's a very iconic site, one of the best-known sites in southern Iraq, where Leonard Woolley dug in the 1920s and 30s, where there's a royal cemetery. And the problem with Ur is that the site is immediately next to what has now become the largest airbase in the Middle East, called Talil. And at Talil, in the early years of the Allied occupation, there were thousands of troops, and they had unlimited access to the site and wandered around it in a fairly uncontrolled sort of a way. However, as far as we could see at that time, there hadn't really been very much damage caused by the military at Ur. And in fact, the local people even profited from the presence of troops at Ur by opening up a souvenir and a gift shop, as you see. There was some damage, but this damage of a different type caused by incoming missiles fired by insurgents from the area of Basra. The ziggurat at Ur, which is one of the best-known landmarks at Ur, was damaged. A lot of shell holes in the ziggurat, caused by we don't know who, but this man here, who, for want of a better word, I should say, was my minder, I suppose, was able to tell by looking at the holes exactly what sort of munition artillery had caused each one of them. And there were a lot of complaints, actually, from the Iraq Department of Antiquities about this damage to the ziggurat. Right, I want to move on to Babylon. All of these case stories are actually quite different in themselves. Babylon, you will know, is another very iconic site. It's on the river Euphrates, about 50 miles south of Baghdad. And on either side of the Euphrates there are groves of palm trees, so it's a rather attractive location. This is pre-war damage, before during, I suppose, the coalition of invasion of 2003. Lots of foxholes were dug around the site for defending troops, defending Iraqi troops, that is, and these are just two of them. The only other thing that happened to Babylon immediately after the invasion was that the gift shop was torched. Nothing worse than that. But then very soon, coalition troops established a major military camp known as Camp Alpha at Babylon. And as you can see, this camp is situated firmly right in the center of the ancient city, on the east bank of the Euphrates River. The existence of this camp caused a lot of very adverse comment in the international press. There were actually howls of protest from various correspondents. And in December 2004, I was asked to go to Babylon by the Iraqi Ministry of Culture to compile a condition report about what damage had been done by the military presence at Babylon. And I have to say it was quite considerable. Obviously, driving very heavy military vehicles around an ancient site is not a very good thing to do. And they even drove these vehicles down the famous ancient processional way, it's called, breaking a lot of the tiles. I should say actually that I'm not attributing blame to any one particular country or anything like that. There were a lot of different countries in the coalition, and many of them were involved in these various exercises that I'm describing. Then there was a heliport established on top of the site. There had always been a helicopter landing pad on the top of Babylon, but now it was greatly expanded, as you can see, and large amounts of the, I won't call it topsoil, it's probably the top 2 or 3 meters of archaeological deposit were scooped up to put into these so-called HESCO containers that you can see down below. They're like gigantic sandbags. And the problem here is that the military authorities were alerted at some point to the fact that they shouldn't be doing this. So what they did instead was bring earth in from outside Babylon, from the desert and from other sites in the vicinity, some of them also in their own right archaeological, which was even worse because when these HESCO containers decompose as they're intended to do, this means that the archaeological record of Babylon will be irreparably contaminated. Then long trenches were dug, I think for no very good reason. They're said to be anti-tank defences, but so far as I know, the insurgents never had any tanks. However that may be, the trench at the top left was 170 metres long and about 3 metres deep, straight through previously undisturbed archaeological deposits, and of course a lot of material was turned up, like ancient pottery and bricks of the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar. there was a fuel farm, and of course many thousands of gallons of fuel leaked into the ground underneath, again contaminating the archaeological record. And some of the dragon figures, Mushushu figures, in the foundations of the Ishtar Gate were damaged, obviously, by soldiers looking for souvenirs. And in fact, while I was there, one departing group of soldiers were searched, and as you can see on the table here, some of the things which were retrieved from their outgoing luggage. However, some good came out of all this, in that Babylon then was taken under the wing of the World Monuments Fund, and the WMF then financed the compiling of a site management plan for Babylon. This is a very good thing, and it is ongoing work. It does require actually an awful lot of research and so on, but it does mean that when this is all finished, everybody will be in the best place to do further investigation, research, and work on Babylon. Now, I want to talk a little bit now about restoration, at Babylon in particular, to start with. Excavations at Babylon were conducted between 1899 and 2017 by a German team led by Robert Calderwey. You can see him here on the bottom left. They discovered a great deal about the topography of ancient Babylon and about the history of the site. I have to say they did very valuable work, but at the end of that exercise there really wasn't very much to see at Babylon, just as much as there hadn't been very much to see in the first place before the Germans started work. And what you see on the left is how the site looked in 1917 when it was occupied by the British Army. The two postcards on the right are from the decades after 1917. The best known monument from Babylon was taken to Berlin. It's the so-called Ishtar Gate, where it's now one of the highlights of the Near Eastern Museum there. What is left in Babylon are the foundations of the Ishtar Gate. It was that I showed you just now, where some bricks had been removed, and this is how it appears in a 1930s postcard. Well, that was Babylon then, in the, let's say, up until the Second World War. Then I think in the 1950s or 60s, the Iraqis themselves did build this half-size replica of the Ishtar Gate, which they put up at the entrance to the site. And that's actually about all that happened until Saddam Hussein came along. And he determined to build a palace at Babylon. It's actually on the top of this circular mound that you can see on the left side, with a roadway sort of curving up, snaking round to go into the palace. And for this he was very much condemned. But it has to be said that this artificial mound, the whole thing is built on the top of an artificial mound, and was actually placed in what had been the ancient bed of the river Euphrates. The river Euphrates has actually changed course over the centuries. So it's not quite as bad as it appeared to be, as it appeared to some people at the time. In order to create this huge mound, he didn't actually cover or destroy any archaeological deposits. Not necessarily that it was an acceptable thing to do, it obviously wasn't, but it could have been worse. And this is a photograph of the palace as it appears nowadays. And as you can see, it's got a very elaborate, ornate decoration inside. This is one of the roofs, the ceilings of one of the rooms. Well, Saddam also did some restoration work at Babylon, not content with just building a palace there. He rebuilt the ancient Greek theatre and turned it into a structure which I think actually could accommodate something like 2,500 people, an enormously large audience. And you can see that this theatre in the aerial photograph above. And various other things were done, like putting the famous Lion of Babylon into a prominent sort of a position so it could easily be seen by visitors. But the largest thing that he did at Babylon was to reconstruct the palace of Nebuchadnezzar. And you can see it here, viewed from the mound on which the Saddam Palace is situated. Here it is, it's a photograph I took from a helicopter, this one, and actually it's interesting because apart from the restored palace on the left-hand side, what you can see on the right is some remains of the military camp. There it is from an aerial satellite photograph, I think. And in fact, this palace is absolutely huge. It contains, as you can see, 5 courtyards and a total of 600 rooms. And the restoration is actually on a gigantic scale, so that the main entrance to the palace is through a reconstructed arch 30 meters high, and many of the walls have now been rebuilt to a height of 18 meters. The picture on the right shows on the left side a heroic figure whose name will be known to many of you, Dr. Donny George, who did so much to help recover, preserve and promote Iraqi cultural heritage. And sadly, he died in March 2011 at the early age of 60. But he was particularly instrumental in drawing public attention to the looting of the Iraq Museum. And as I've said, he played a key role together with Matthew Bogdanos in recovering many of the stolen items. But what is less well known, perhaps, is that for a while, Donny George was actually in charge of the Babylon restoration project, and I had the opportunity to talk to him about that, because a lot of people, a lot of archaeologists were very, very critical of this project. But as he said to me, there was nothing whatever for people to see at Babylon, either the local people or tourists. So we felt that it would be a good thing to humour Saddam in this respect. So that's really the history of the rebuilding of Nebuchadnezzar's palace, which incidentally was done in part using new specially made bricks with an inscription of Saddam Hussein on them. But I want now to digress a little bit and just ask whether Saddam really knew what he was restoring. And this has a bearing, of course, on the principles of restoration work generally. On the right, you can see the palace in its entirety, with the 5 different courtyards. And on the left, you can see just the western part of the palace. Now, it's always been known that the little structure in green, which is tacked on at the left-hand side, was a later addition by the Persian king Artaxerxes II. It's clear for various reasons. It's actually in the style of a Persian Apadana building, and as nobody has ever questioned the identification of that building. But now a Belgian archaeologist, Herman Gasch, has suggested that the whole of the west part of this palace was actually built in the Persian period. In particular, I think the argument is completely convincing in terms of the left-hand courtyard, because A, it's not bonded with the building next to it, and B, it's got a peculiar type of, I'll have to go over to the screen and explain to you. It's got these 2 reception rooms here, which is called, it's an architectural design, which is called a salle à 4 salons, which is a room with 4 buttresses. And the idea is that these buttresses, they're supported transverse barrel roofs at either end, and a barrel roof running down the centre. And this is a very distinctive Iranian Persian design. So I think it is certain that that part of the palace was added on in the Persian period, and probably the courtyard next to it as well. There's some good evidence that might have been. And we know, incidentally, that the whole palace was also used throughout the Persian period, as you can see from these 2 columns here in one of the courtyards. So the great irony here, obviously, is that Saddam, during the Iraq-Iran war, spent millions, probably billions, of dinars restoring a palace which may in the first place have been partly Iranian. Anyway, the question, I think, is should the palace have been rebuilt? I take the same view as Donny George. Yes, I think that it should have been. There was very little for visitors to see at Babylon. Without that, I think it is a good thing. But it was built on the cheap, and it was thrown up in a very short period of time. And there are some now severe problems, as you can see. There's rising damp, and some of the floors are buckling, and it's going to be an absolute nightmare to conserve. I really don't know what can be done about it. But it's all this restoration work at Babylon which has prevented it from being nominated as a World Heritage Site. So I don't know what the outcome of all that is going to be. I'm going on now to Mosul, which, as you heard this morning, was occupied by Daesh between 2014 and 2017, and during that time they did an incredible amount of damage to the architectural and cultural heritage of Mosul. This is one of the very significant buildings that was blown up very early on in the Daesh occupation. This is the shrine of Nebi Yunus, of the prophet Jonah, and the minaret in the shrine was a landmark for many miles around, but that was, of course, doesn't exist anymore. One interesting fact here is that after the shrine had been blown up, it was discovered underneath it that there were lots of tunnels, and these tunnels had been made into what proved to be an Assyrian palace of Esarhaddon. I don't think any damage had been done to the reliefs that were exposed in these tunnels, and everybody's assumed that these were tunnels which were done by Daesh, but I myself am not so sure about this, and I wouldn't be surprised if some of them at least at the end of the day proved to have been done by Layard or Rassam, the early British excavators at Nineveh, because of course they weren't allowed to excavate in the vicinity of the shrine. These are two more monuments in Mosul that have been completely destroyed, the tomb of Jarjis, and others are the famous Al-Nuri Mosque and the Al-Hadba minaret. But some of these buildings, I think, are scheduled to be reconstructed with money from the United Arab Emirates and from Kuwait. I think we haven't got time to go into that now, and I don't really know enough about it, but these reconstructions and offers of help in themselves sometimes are problematic. Sorry, I've gone on a bit too far. Well, then, on 10th of September 2018, UNESCO held a meeting in Paris with the title Revive the Spirit of Mosul, which I was privileged to be able to attend. And at that meeting, Qais al-Rashid, the director of the State Board of Antiquities and Heritage, told us that 206 heritage buildings have been destroyed in Mosul, 431 significant heritage houses, 108 mosques, 15 shrines, and 19 churches. We were then shown harrowing scenes of the destroyed sites, some of them so completely flattened that the buildings could never be restored. In fact, some of these sites are now car lots. They've been deliberately turned into car parks in order to forestall any possible ideas of restoration and rebuilding. Some of the major buildings certainly can be rebuilt. Whether they should be is a moot question. We heard this morning from Eleanor about one of the churches in Mosul, that the local population was unlikely to return to worship there if it ever was rebuilt. But in general terms, I just want to tell you that at this UNESCO meeting, one of the officers of UNESCO made some what I thought were very interesting points, and he said that the following are all prerequisites to the restoration of residential areas such as Mosul. Number one is an obvious one, which is demining and making the area safe. That's clear. Now, number two is something one doesn't necessarily think of. It's before you do anything, you've got to provide or re-provide basic services like water, electricity, healthcare, and schools. Not so easy as it sounds, obviously. Then thirdly, you've got to provide jobs and incomes for the people that are coming back to these abandoned areas. And the fourth, most difficult of all, is trying to promote community reconciliation. Very, very difficult in a place like Mosul. And then I think we mustn't underestimate the difficulties and costs of restoration. I remind you that 20 years after the end of the Bosnian War in 1995, practically the only monument rebuilt in Bosnia and Herzegovina is the old Ottoman bridge in Mostar. And then there's the Neues Museum in Berlin on the Museum Island, destroyed during World War II in 1943, only reopened in 2009, after a restoration and rebuilding project supervised by David Chipperfield. And this, I remind you, is in Germany with all its financial resources and capacity. What hope is there really for Mosul? I'm going on now to Nemrut. This is a very old photograph which shows the ziggurat at the end of the mound. The main building, I think one of the principal buildings at Nemrut, and the only one which had in any way been restored, was the Northwest Palace of Ashurnasirpal II. He was a 9th century king. Excavations in that Northwest Palace had taken place in the 19th century, principally by Layard, and many of the reliefs from the Northwest Palace removed, for example, mainly to the British Museum, but also to other museums around the world. But there were nevertheless about 50 reliefs still left there in the Northwest Palace. This is a view of the sort of reconstructed palace as seen from the top of the ziggurat. It's actually a very interesting visitor experience, I have to say. These are the colossal gateway figures being left behind by the early excavators. So this is how it was before the arrival of Daesh on the site. And some of the reliefs there are extremely interesting because they preserve traces of original colour, like this one, where you can see that this figure of a genie with a black beard. Nearly all the reliefs in the British Museum and other Western museums were scrubbed clean in the Victorian period when they arrived, so it's very difficult now to see any trace of these original colours. Well, now we come on to the Daesh video, which was released in April 2015. I won't dwell too long on this because it's a very distressing sight. The video shows insurgents smashing reliefs, gathering them up with a shovel, with laying barrels of explosive next to the reliefs themselves, and then blowing them up in a massive explosion, which left us with a pile of rubble. I know Eleanor's been to Nemrut. I haven't since then, so I don't know exactly how bad it is. Well, one can obviously see that it's very, very bad. But the question that arises, of course, is should Nemrut be reconstructed? I referred to this UNESCO meeting in Paris, and there was a lot of discussion about it at the meeting. And interestingly, nearly everybody at the meeting, including most of the UNESCO officials, were of the view that it shouldn't be restored. My view is totally different to that. I think that it should be. The palace should be restored, brought back to something as it was in the first place. I believe that that is something, or I've been led to understand, that that is something that the local population would appreciate. And, you know, one of the things here is that, yes, the palace as it was when it was blown up was mostly reconstruction in the first place. Certainly the reliefs were not. They were original pieces, but the walls and roofs and so on had all been rebuilt. And I'd like to remind you that when Max Mallowan and his wife Agatha Christie arrived there in 1949, there was nothing at all to see except the ziggurat. And Agatha Christie describes her reaction to Nimrud on first arrival. The Tigris was just a mile away, and on the great mound, big stone Assyrian heads poked out of the soil, and in one place there was the enormous wing of a great genie. And that's what you can see in those photos there. Incidentally, the photograph at the top shows the ziggurat at Nimrud, and this is a ziggurat that was 43 meters high, and this actually is, I suppose, the worst thing of all which has happened at Nimrud. This ziggurat has been completely demolished. I believe that the whole structure has been pushed into the ancient bed of the Tigris, and this is really erasing memory. You know, this ziggurat was a landmark for many miles around. It was the most distinctive feature in the region, and to have removed it like this is to have taken it away, to have erased it, as I say, from the memory of local people. It was a quite appalling thing to do. I'm presumably, I suppose, there are probably enough photographs, or there could be, with crowdsourcing for the ziggurat to be put back again into some state as it was before, and I very much hope that it will be. Here are some more photographs taken by Agatha Christie. No, not taken by Agatha Christie, because there she is on the left-hand side of the one on the left. But the one on the right is certainly by her. So that was how Nimrud appeared in 1949 when the Malouins arrived there. And this is early attempts at restoring the Northwest Palace, actually by the Iraq Department of Antiquities. It was they who did all this work. It wasn't done by the foreign excavators or anything like that. And this is one of the first doorways that was restored, and that was in the 1950s. I think there are many buildings in Iraq to which the same will apply as to the Northwest Palace at Nimrud. In other words, that they were restored in recent times, and what was actually destroyed was more or less a restoration, and that's, I think, the case with the famous Arba'in Mosque in Tikrit. And in these circumstances, I see no reason at all why it shouldn't be restored. Well, this is just an example of what you can do with 3D digital printing, the Arch at Palmyra, but it also allows me to say that the monuments that were destroyed at Palmyra were not as the Palmyrines had left them, but they were very much left as reconstructed by the French Mandate in the 1920s and 1930s. So there really isn't much reason why these things shouldn't be put back to the state they were in the first place. I just put now on a couple of slides to remind us all that we shouldn't in any way be sanctimonious or complacent. This is the sort of damage that was inflicted in this and other European countries in at the time of the Reformation. People will say that it wasn't as bad as the damage inflicted by ISIS, but that's probably because they didn't have explosives at that time. Now, just the picture on the left shows a picture of Shakespeare's house, which was demolished as recently as, not so long ago, 1759, simply because the owner was fed up with people coming to Stratford and asking to see where Shakespeare had lived. So he knocked down the house, and nobody said anything about it at the time. And on the right is a picture of a church in West Wales, where in the mid-90s, it's a very interesting 12th, 13th century church, and in the mid-19th century, the local landlord decided to take the roof off because he didn't like locals coming so close to his house. So he built another church a mile away. Now I just want to conclude on what I think is some good news, which is about Basra Museum. which was mentioned this morning. There was a museum in Basra up until the time of the First Gulf War, but it was looted at that time, that's in 1990, and any antiquities that were saved and salvaged were sent back to Baghdad. It's actually a very attractive house, but not really suitable as a museum. Well, then, in 1997, General Barney White Spunner came to the British Museum. He was about to be deployed to Iraq as the General Officer Commanding Multinational Division Southeast. And he came to the British Museum asking what he could do to help promote and protect Iraqi cultural heritage. And I have to say, he deserves a great deal of credit for that, because as far as I know, he was almost unique amongst British political, military and diplomatic figures in this respect. Anyway, he came to the museum and he was informed that the most useful thing he could do was do a survey of museums within his area to see which could be restored, and perhaps to look at archaeological sites. I've already told you about the visit to the 8 archaeological sites which he organised. So this is the museum. They looked actually at 4 different museums in southern Iraq and decided that Basra would be the only one which would actually be suitable for restoration, reorganisation and so on. And the army engineers decided this is in cooperation with Iraqi colleagues, including the director of the museum, Khatan al-Abid, that a former palace of Saddam would lend itself very well indeed to being a new museum. It's a very grand building with painted ceilings and ornate woodwork. And Khatan drew up this fairly speedily, drew up this plan of how the building could be transformed into a museum. And initially, I should say that in order to allow funds to be channeled through for this project, we had to establish a new charity, which is called Friends of Basra Museum. And we got a wonderful start with a $500,000 donation from BP. And it was largely thanks to that donation that it proved possible to fit out one of the rooms in the museum. There are basically 4 galleries in the museum. So one of them was opened on 27th September 2016. And you can see here the director, Khatan al-Abid, next to him, Maysoon Damluji, who's the Iraqi member of parliament responsible for culture, and next to her, the director of the State Board of Antiquities and Heritage. And this is the one room that was opened at that time. It's a gallery devoted to the cultural heritage of Basra and the Basra region. And these are the objects, some of the objects in the cases. There's still work to be done. We have to admit there's no labelling in place at the moment, but I hope that there will be before too long. And then after that, we were fortunate to get further grants from the Cultural Protection Fund, totaling, I think, about £600,000 altogether. And it was then possible to open the remaining 3 galleries in March of this year. These are pictures of the opening ceremony. The other 3 galleries are devoted to Babylon, to Assyria, and to Sumer. They're all, as you see, colour-coded. I wouldn't necessarily have done that myself, but they are colour-coded. The Basra one that you just seen was purple in colour. I have to say that all of the decisions here have been on the Iraqi side. To be perfectly honest, if I had been given a choice, I wouldn't have organised the museum like this, with these 4 galleries, but this was the way they wanted to do it, and it very much reflects the Iraqi curriculum and indeed the layout in the Iraq Museum itself, which perhaps we might refer back to later. There's also an education room in this museum, and another room which has not yet been opened is going to be a library stocked mostly with books which have been very generously donated by the British Institute for the Study of Iraq. On the right, you can see a 3D print of one of these Lamassu figures which has been made in Italy. Actually, I forgot to mention when we were on the subject of Nemrut that the firm Factum Arte in Madrid has made a series of replicas of all of the reliefs in Ashurnasirpal's throne room. They did it after digital scanning, and they did at some stage send all of these reliefs to Mosul. I'm not quite sure what has happened to them now, but no doubt new versions could be made if necessary, and these could certainly be put into a reconstructed Ashurnasirpal palace. Well, I just will finish with this image, which is a group of school pupils visiting this new museum in Basra. Obviously, young people are the key to the future, and moving forward, we need to think how the world can help them to protect cultural heritage. And I think myself, there are 2 ways. One is by investing more resources in education, of course, that's hugely important. And the second is by promoting what is known as positive peace and everything that entails. Perhaps we might talk a little bit about that later. Well, my time's up now, so on that note I'll stop and thank you for listening.